to The World This Week, where we dissect the top stories of the past 5 days with journalists from around the world. In the second half of our programme, we'll go to the Middle East to discuss Mike Pompeo's farewell tour, Trump's legacy, as well as the COVID vaccines. Might there be light at the end of the tunnel? But first, the United Nations says a full-scale humanitarian crisis is unfolding in Ethiopia, and the EU budget stalemate there. Might there be a way through? Our guests in the first half are France 24's International Affairs editor Philip Turle and Victor Mallet from the Financial Times. Good evening to you both. I'd normally have you in the studio with me. Lockdown's keeping you in your homes. Philip, are you all right? Lockdown in Paris?
Yes, it's going okay. It's a bit strange not to be actually with you in the studio, Nada. It takes a bit of getting used to, but I think you have to put safety first at the moment and staying at home, respecting social distancing and doing everything you can to prevent the virus from getting to you or eventually spreading it to someone else is what you need to do. And that is why all the staff here at France 24, a number of us are working from home and are not in the studio with you tonight, regretfully.
Absolutely. We are doing our best. Victor Mallet, all well where you are?
Yes, I mean, this lockdown is a little bit more normal than the last one in the sense that at least you see school kids going to school in the streets in the morning and coming back in the evening. But otherwise, yes, I think we're all getting a bit tired of lockdown, but I think we all realise that this seems to be the only way to crack it, really.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Let's crack on with our first story tonight, because it was just 13 months ago that Ethiopia's Prime Minister was awarded the Nobel Prize for Peace. Now, though, critics say Abiy Ahmed is leading his nation into war. The northern Tigray region, thousands of people there are on the move. They are fleeing 2 weeks of fighting between rebels from the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front and the government. Now, there are already accusations of atrocities on both sides. The United Nations warning of possible war crimes. Now, a bit earlier this week, I spoke to the Ethiopian ambassador to France. He was pretty adamant that this is going to be a short conflict and that they were doing what they can to keep civilians safe. Take a listen to a bit of what he told me.
We are well now on progress to making sure that food and aid is delivered. That will be delivered very quickly. And as the situation stabilizes, and especially as the operations winds up, which we believe will wind up in a couple of days, things will get back to normal.
Philip Turle, you heard the ambassador there saying they're doing what they can to protect civilians, but the facts on the ground don't particularly appear to match his words, do they? I mean, the United Nations saying today that over 2 million children are in urgent need.
Well, that certainly is the case. And if you look at the situation on the ground, as you were saying, these tens of thousands of people fleeing out of Eritrea out of Tigray into neighboring Sudan, and then Eritrea also being accused of involvement in this war. It appears that the words that we've just heard there are words of hope, but on the ground, the situation is completely different. And I think what is very much disturbing in this story is that we don't really know what is going on there, because all contact has been broken, all the internet and communications have been stopped as far as Tigray is concerned. And the only information coming out of there is from refugees who are describing, as you said before, war crimes on the ground. Both sides are accusing each other of involvement in this conflict. And until we actually know precisely what is going on, and there is a real effort, I think, but on the part of the international community to bring these two sides to the table to at least begin discussions on finding a way out of this crisis and not continuing in this war, in this conflict, then I really feel that we're seeing something that could fathom out into a much wider regional conflict, and that is something that really has got to be avoided at all costs.
Well, let me get Victor Mallet's thoughts on that. I know you were there quite a long time ago, back in the 1980s, but it is perhaps worth emphasising that while we are seeing a flare in violence now, there have been tensions in this region, for decades.
That's right. I mean, the Tigrayans, the Eritreans who left, some decades ago, split off from Ethiopia and became an independent country. And it's true. And one of the problems is that the Tigrayans, in the form of Meles Zenawi, were running Ethiopia. when Tigray was sort of firmly entrenched in Ethiopia, and they were running the government for something like 27 years, I think. And both that government and Abiy Ahmed, in some ways, were seen as kind of golden boys of development. You know, they really helped the economy. They brought the country back together, got it on its feet. And now, of course, it's these old kind of tensions are coming back to haunt Ethiopia, and it is a real tragedy, and it's potentially an even worse tragedy when you think how important Ethiopia is. It's a very large country, 110 million people. The food situation is always rather fragile there because of drought. You remember there was a great famine in the 1980s. So, it really is a very sort of risky situation. And it's another example, unfortunately, of democracy and freedom being under threat in Africa at the moment.
Yes, and as you say there, there has been this sort of perception in the past that Ethiopia is almost too big, too important to fail. Philip Turl, I want to push you a little bit on something you mentioned a bit earlier, talking about the fears of a potential spillover in this conflict. What do you mean by that? Are you concerned that Eritrea could be drawn in? And what are your concerns?
Well, Eritrea is an arch enemy of the people of Tigray, and there are already attacks which are taking place from Tigray into Eritrea and vice versa. And of course, the blame is being laid on both parties for involvement in that. But the TPLF, the Tigray forces, are saying that any attempt to launch attacks from airports outside of Tigray will be met with fighting and retaliatory attacks from within Tigray. So there is a possibility that this could get out of hand, and very quickly. And that's why I think that this estimation that it was going to be over in a couple of days is wildly optimistic. It's already been more than a couple of days now that this conflict got underway. And I think a lot of people are looking towards the African Union saying, well, you need to get stuck into this to try to work out some kind of solution. But the problem is that the African Union has its headquarters in Addis Ababa, which is in Ethiopia. And the African Union also needs the government of Ethiopia in its fight against Shabab rebels in neighboring Somalia, and Shabab rebels which are also active in Kenya. So it's, if you like, it's treading on glass in its negotiations with the government in Ethiopia about what it can do, and it doesn't want to fall foul of that government, which of course would sabotage any attempt to try to find a solution to this current conflict. And on top of that, there is something else which is drastic that we've already talked about, and that is the plight of all these refugees and all these people. Now, if you look at the situation in Tigray, 600,000 people there, this is according to humanitarian organizations, depend on food aid. That food aid is not getting into there. And to make matters worse, the government of Ethiopia has shut down all the banks in Tigray and preventing people from taking money out. So that's going to exacerbate a situation which is already bad. And there's a lot of worry that people who are caught up in this conflict are literally going to start starving to death, and that's going to push them out into Sudan and into other neighboring countries, and it's going to make this into a much wider conflict.
Philip, certainly real concerns there. We have a lot of ground to cover on the programme, so I want to move on to one of the other top stories that we're covering today, and that is the situation in the European Union. The EU still hasn't finished sorting out its really rather messy divorce from the United Kingdom, but it's now being plunged into another crisis. That is its budget. Poland and Hungary both blocking the passage of the 7-year budget worth 1.8 trillion euros. Now, their objection is the so-called rule of law mechanism that would allow the bloc to deny funds to countries that violate democratic norms. That is something that both Hungary and Poland have been accused of doing for several years now. Now, talks to try and resolve all of this were held last night. Certainly no breakthrough there. Let's take a listen to a bit of what the German Chancellor Angela Merkel had to say.
For all or nearly all member states, the financial framework and the conditionality mechanism are of course seen as a package. That's why Hungary and Poland have vetoed the recovery plan and the proposed budget. This means that we cannot submit these documents to the European Parliament yet, and that there won't be a decision in the coming week. As holder of the rotating presidency, Germany will continue to talk to Hungary and Poland to see what can be done to secure their agreement.
All right, Victor Mallet, Merkel saying there won't be a decision in the coming week. Do you see a way through this?
It looks as though there is still room for compromise. You have Viktor Orban today talking about the need for compromise, and as long as we've got political will, it might be possible. There were some fairly similar words coming out of the Polish leadership. So I think it's not impossible that in the big summit in December 10, it starts, you could have a kind of deal. I mean, the problem is that those who want the rule of law mechanism to stay and insist that it does stay are not backing down. They won't back down. The European Parliament, the European Commission, and other members of the EU. And the other thing is that the money, a lot of this budget money, and especially the COVID recovery money, is destined to go to Poland and to Hungary. So they will suffer almost the most of all the countries if the budget does not go through. So I think we could well see a compromise. But I think, the worrying thing, I suppose, for the EU is that freedom, democracy, and above all, the independence of the judiciary, which is really what is in question here in both Poland and Hungary, is absolutely fundamental to the way the EU is seen by most of its members. And so if Poland and Hungary are going against that, they're not really going to be welcome for much longer. But obviously nobody wants them to leave. They want them to change their ways.
Well, absolutely. And let me bring Philip Tellin on that. I mean, how serious do you view this stalemate to be? Is this, in your eyes, an existential moment for the EU, not unlike Brexit?
Well, I think what we're seeing here is a cross between a poker game where each one is trying to negotiate. They're going to win some, they're going to lose some, but at the end there'll be some kind of compromise, possibly next month with a bit of luck. Or we're in a waiting game where each side is going to sit and wait and see who can wait the longest before one side is going to give in. Now, Poland and Hungary receive about 5% of their GDP from Brussels, so they desperately need the money. But what they don't want is to feel like they're being blackmailed by Brussels into changing their ways when they've been accused of undermining the judiciary, being against same-sex marriage, in the case of Hungary, refusing to resettle migrants and putting pressure on Greece and Italy. So there is a lot of pressure on them to change their ways. But of course, they've got their eyes in the rearview mirror for the upcoming elections, and they don't want to lose those elections. So they're trying to stick to their agenda. And that's where there's a clash of ideas here. But the bottom line is that the behaviour by both Hungary and Poland is unacceptable to Brussels. So there's going to have to be some kind of compromise somewhere down the line. And it's true that the European Union doesn't want to lose those two countries, but it's not willing to put up with two countries laying down the law and at the same time demanding equal treatment of all the other countries that all the other countries get when they are respecting the rule of law that the EU has voted in. So it's, I think, a case of seeing how things work out between now and December. We'll see whether there has been a compromise. I'm optimistic there probably will be, because Hungary and Poland, as I said, they both need the money. But it depends who's going to give in first here, whether it's going to be the EU or the other EU countries and Brussels, or whether it's going to be Poland and Hungary who eventually say, OK, you've won, we'll accept. But it's going to be very difficult.
All right. You say there, Philip, the EU doesn't want to lose Poland and Hungary. Victor Mallet, does that mean, in your view, we're not looking at another Brexit, slightly less snappy, I suppose, but a Hexit or a Pexit? Is that off the cards in your view?
I think it's unlikely at this stage. I mean, I think there is a sort of existential problem for Western democracy, if you like, and it comes mainly from the other side of the Atlantic, where we have Donald Trump still refusing to acknowledge the results of the election, and indeed essentially undermining the independence of the judiciary in the United States. And of course, Viktor Orban is one of his allies. The Poles are among the Polish government is among his allies. The Slovenian, who weighed in briefly on the side of Poland and Hungary, the Slovenian Prime Minister is also one of his allies. So you have a sort of slightly disturbing situation for Western Democrats, Western liberals, if you like, those who believe in the rule of law. But I think this particular spat will, in fact, probably will be resolved by the next summit in December.
Philip Tell, do you agree? We're looking at a resolution by next month. Briefly, if you can, we've got very little time.
Well, I hope so. I mean, I think the bottom line here is that what Warsaw is trying to do is to try to block up the EU budget, saying, well, look, we can wait for a year before we receive the money because we're well enough off to do that. But we can put pressure on southern European countries who can't wait that long. And that's why we may be able to win the day here. But as I said, this is like negotiating in the souk. You give some, you lose some, you win some. We'll see who is the better negotiator here. But I agree that both Hungary and Poland don't really want to leave the EU because they're getting far too much money as members of the EU. It would be a lot harder for them if they were no longer members.
Yeah, and I suppose we have seen as well that the real challenges of trying to leave the EU, as we're seeing now with that very drawn-out Brexit process. And we are going to have to leave it there, but I want to thank you both very much indeed. Victor Mallet from the Financial Times, Philip Tell from France 24. Thank you both very much indeed. Thank you for watching the France 24 World this week. Do stay with us. The second half is coming up very shortly. Welcome to part 2 of The World This Week, and I want to welcome our guests for the second half, Borzou Daragahi, correspondent internationally for The Independent, and Iris Makler, our correspondent in Jerusalem. Hello to you both. Thank you very much for being on the programme.
My pleasure.
Mine too.
Iris, you're in Jerusalem. Mike Pompeo was recently there as well, the US's top diplomat. He's on something of a farewell tour of the Middle East. He's now just touched down in Abu Dhabi, trying to shore up the Trump administration's legacy there in the Gulf. He was in the Golan Heights yesterday. Let's take a listen to a little of what he said when he was there.
You can't stand here and stare out at what's across the border and deny the central thing that President Trump recognized that previous presidents had refused to do, that this is a part of Israel, and a central part of Israel. The United States of America and the Trump administration will continue to do all that we can to make sure that Israel has what it needs to do just that. And we will honor your right to defend your own people.
All right, Iris, I know you were in the Golan Heights pretty recently. Palestinians clearly pretty outraged by his trip to the Golan and also his trip to a settlement. In your view, was this a particularly provocative act by Pompeo?
I will quote to you what a leading left-wing newspaper here put as its editorial, and they said it's the final days of Pompeo, and that's a good thing because the stand that he took while he was in Israel was an extremist right-wing stand. At some stages, he sounded like he was a representative of the settler movement, so says this newspaper. And that's not all of Israeli politics. And they felt that everything that he did and said was extreme in this last farewell tour. Very much, Christian evoked imagery all the way in everything that he said, and very extreme positions with respect to the Israel-Palestine conflict, including, of course, about settlements made in Israel to be stamped on goods that are exported to the US from here when they come from settlement farms and produce and so forth. And, people have fought long and hard for that not to be the case. It is something that perhaps the Biden administration would overturn, but it was remarkable to hear it in the final moments, the last 61 days now of the Trump administration.
Borzou Daragahi, I wonder how much you think Pompeo's words and his actions really matter here? I mean, this is effectively a lame duck Trump administration. Couldn't the incoming Biden team simply reverse some of these controversial policies, whether they are in Israel or elsewhere in the Middle East?
I would say two things. I think that Mike Pompeo is out for Mike Pompeo, and he's shoring up his political prospects for a possible 2024 run. He has an incredible ego, and he thinks of himself as a potential heir to the Trump political machine. And, you know, with regard to can Biden simply reverse this stuff? Yes, but at a political cost. And that is going to make, you know, his job a little bit more difficult, a little bit more complicated. To reverse these things will raise hackles among some segments in Washington and Congress. It'll create tensions with Israel. So, you know, he's creating problems and roadblocks and little booby traps for Biden.
Let me ask you more broadly then, Borzu, you cover the Middle East for The Independent. Do you expect a sort of sea change in American foreign policy there with this incoming administration? Or do you expect on a lot of issues, Syria, Yemen, indeed Israel, that actually the status quo might just about hold?
I think that there were already moves afoot to address issues such as Yemen. Look, you know, the U.S. foreign policy machinery has been on a certain trajectory with regard to the Middle East. And Trump was sort of an anomaly to that trajectory. U.S. is less and less dependent on Persian Gulf oil, and that has meant a downgrading of relations with Saudi Arabia in general. Trump, for some reason, seemed to really admire the autocracy in Saudi Arabia, and so kind of treated them like the closest of allies. I think that's going to go away. I think that there's going to be a genuine effort on the part of the Biden administration to re-enter the Iran nuclear deal. I think that there will be, and there already is, it's already starting a bit of more re-engagement between the United States and the Palestinians. But I don't think there's going to be any kind of dramatic break from what most people in the world are used to as sort of mainstream, conventional U.S. Middle East policy, which many people in the Middle East really despise.
All right, you mentioned the Iran nuclear deal. Hassan Rouhani, the Iranian leader, has been sort of alluding to that deal in recent days. Let's take a listen to what he had to say about plans to work with the new Biden administration.
Some think that when we say the situation will improve, we want to negotiate with the US. This is not about negotiating with the US, it's a different issue. The new US administration will go back to a situation where they respect regulations as much as they used to, because the outgoing US government did not respect any regulations and was unruly. Now the situation is changing again, and it could be an improvement, meaning that we can gradually go from an atmosphere of threats to an atmosphere of opportunity.
All right, Iris Makler, allusions there from Hassan Rouhani that there may be greater willingness for a Biden administration to work with Iran, perhaps on rejoining the JCPOA, the Iranian nuclear deal. That would be really rather bad news for Israel, wouldn't it?
It would definitely be bad news for Benjamin Netanyahu, who has made, you know, the Iranian issue and being a hardliner on Iran and being the only one to perceive the true threat from Iran. It's the strength of his political views. It's what he has preached all the time that he's been in office. However, I think, you know, Israel is also pragmatic, and I think I have read, I don't know where the analysts get this from, but they do say that this time round we won't see Netanyahu working against the administration in quite the way he did during the Obama period and in the lead up to the agreement being signed. So perhaps even though he is losing his partner in Donald Trump on this issue, he does realise that he will have to try and get the best deal he can.
Borzu Daragahi, what's your view on that? From an Iranian perspective on all of this, do you think that the Iranian government hopes that the United States will simply rejoin the deal, that it will be straightforward and smooth?
And nothing's ever straightforward and smooth in the world anymore, especially not in the Middle East. I think there's a 4-month, 5-month window of opportunity between the day, January 20th, that President Biden will be sworn in, and the day in June when there's an election in Iran, presidential election, which will mean the departure of the Rouhani administration and potentially the beginning of a much more hardline, much more intransigent government in Tehran, a much more strident tone coming from Tehran. And if in that time they can sort of work out a deal to resume where they were at, some version of the status quo ante before the Trump administration pulled out of the nuclear deal, that would be, I think, pretty tough, but potentially possible. And, with regard, there was this question of, is this bad for Israel? The Iran nuclear deal was in place for, 2 years, really, until Trump administration started withdrawing from it. And nothing happened. The world didn't end. As a matter of fact, Iran's nuclear arsenal, its nuclear technology arsenal, is a lot more vast than it was a year ago when the Iranian government started, responding to Trump's sanctions and started resuming enrichment without limits and so on. So in a way, it could, if they return to that status quo ante, Iran will be even farther from a nuclear weapon and potentially, in some interpretations, even less of a threat to Israel.
Iris Makler, let me get your response to that. Do you agree then about what sort of happened in the past couple of years, and whether you think now that the Netanyahu government may be losing an ally and I suppose a real friend in the White House?
I think the Netanyahu government would say openly that it's sorry to see Donald Trump not having a second term. There was a very strong relationship between the two governments, a very strong relationship between the two men, actually, a bromance, as we've discussed. So I do think he is sorry to see him go. There's no doubt about that. However, I don't see, they weren't married to him. And I think they are pragmatic enough to make the pivot to the new administration in Washington and to see what is the best deal for them at the moment, what they can persuade their allies in Washington to do. If you read the New York Times, you'll see there's a very strong relationship between the two security services. I'm just thinking of that extraordinary story of the past little while about the assassination of an Al-Qaeda man second in command in Al-Qaeda, who was actually in Tehran. So all of these things, there's a very strong relationship with or without Donald Trump. And I agree that there is this window of opportunity. But of course, I agree with Borazou about that. But this is exactly the time when I think that Biden will be looking to the economy and to dealing with COVID in America and may not have that laser sharp focus on international affairs that he might want to have.
Indeed. Well, let me bring that question directly to you, Borazou Daragahi. Do you agree that the Biden administration will be far more focused on its domestic problems than its international ones? A bit earlier on today on the program, we were talking about the possibility of rehabilitating the image of Saudi Arabia. Obviously, Mohammed bin Salman was very close to Donald Trump. Is that relationship going to change, do you think, under a Biden administration, or will they really try to ignore Saudi Arabia, focus on the problems at home?
I think that they will try to focus on the problems at home, but it's in some ways a lot more complicated. You have to deal with Congress and so on. And foreign policy will be an area where Biden can score some easy wins. And again, with regard to Saudi Arabia, I think there's just a natural drift from the Middle East. There's a natural disengagement that's taking place in Washington. And I think that Saudi Arabia is not going to become a close friend or a foe. It's just going to start receding in its importance and in the influence it has on policy. This weird relationship between MBS and Trump, that's not going to continue anymore, and it probably will never come back again.
All right, we will leave Trump's Middle East legacy on that note. And I want to move on now and end the program with some possible good news. And that is that this week we found out there is not just one highly effective COVID vaccine in the pipeline, but two. trials from Moderna show that their vaccine is nearly 95% effective. Now, that follows the news last week that Pfizer's vaccine is also able to fight the virus in the vast majority of cases. So could the end be in sight to the pandemic? Iris Makler, let me ask you, in Israel, the news of these vaccine breakthroughs, I imagine they've been met with a good deal of relief because Israel has been hit very hard by coronavirus.
Yes, they have been met with relief. In fact, I just saw a poll that said in September, 45% of Israelis were worried or could see an optimistic outcome. So 65% were worried. Now we see that those numbers changing. 55% now can see an optimistic outcome. But an interesting other line in the same poll was that when they were asked who would actually take the first vaccine, although I actually think there might even be 3 vaccines if we really look at it, Moderna, Pfizer and the Russian vaccine, which I know that Israel has been negotiating for, only something like 33% of women and 47% of men said they would be happy to be in the first lot of vaccine takers. So it's kind of a little bit of a mixed picture, but I do think it's the relief of even here, as that we haven't even left the second lockdown, and they're already talking about a third lockdown because the numbers have started to rise again. I think the relief of knowing that there is something else you could do has been enormous.
Yeah, Bozu Deragai, we were talking a bit earlier on the programme about Iran. Clearly that is a country that's been very hardly hit by coronavirus. I wonder if you think it is significant that these 2 vaccines we're talking about have been produced by an American company and a German American company. Do you have any sense of whether that's affected the kind of the news, how the news of the vaccine has been met in Iran?
I mean, I think that these sorts of, on the other hand, I would say much more important is the Biden administration's commitment to joining the WHO. There is talk from the European Commission president today at the beginning of the G20 summit about real global efforts at addressing public health dilemmas and issues. Antonio Guterres, UN Secretary General, has talked about revitalizing global cooperation in the wake of Biden's resumption. And, this is going to be a real, hopefully non-political issue. This is a public health issue, and it doesn't matter. Viruses don't care if you're Iranian or American or German or Italian or Israeli. The virus has hit everybody, and hopefully, and I think that is the spirit of the times, or it will be at least as far as public health concerns and world public health concerns go. I think that is not going to become an issue in Iran or anywhere else.
All right. And it is worth saying, though, that it is not just a scientific breakthrough that we need to bring an end to this pandemic. It is also logistical advancements needed all over the world, because the practicalities of rolling out a COVID vaccine all over the world are absolutely enormous. France 24's Catherine Viette has been looking at some of the challenges just here in France. Here's her report.
It's an immense challenge. A global vaccination campaign for nearly 8 billion people. It's also a logistical headache for which the airline industry is getting ready. At Air France, a task force has already been put in place. The major challenge, keeping the vaccine cold with the help of these special containers. Pfizer Laboratories' vaccine must be stored at temperatures of minus 80 degrees.
Minus 80 degrees is technically feasible. It's not the easiest, but it is doable. To maintain minus 80 degrees throughout the chain, from leaving the laboratory to arriving at the clinic, it's still quite a long time.
This 777 jetliner can carry up to 100 tons of cargo in its huge hold. Globally, around 8,000 planes like this might be needed.
It's going to be a big logistical challenge because there are going to be massive shipments. We won't know until the last moment when the vaccines will be produced, and we won't know until the last moment where they'll be sent. So that's a big challenge too.
Possibly in a few weeks, hundreds of thousands of doses of the vaccine could begin passing through Charles de Gaulle Airport. Precious cargo that'll be watched closely.
It's a product that's highly desired. And that's why we have this task force in place at the airport, in which the police are involved.
Another difficulty, delays. Custom formalities and mandatory quarantines for airline crews could slow the delivery of the vaccine to certain parts of the world.
All right, Catherine Viette reporting there. And Bozu Daragaye, I mean, you heard it in that report. Many of these vaccines need to be stored in extremely cold temperatures. People will need shots twice. I mean, in some of the places that you cover, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, there simply isn't the facilities to roll out a vaccination program like this, is there?
Yeah, I mean, this is going to take a while. I imagine that over the course of the next couple of years, there'll be better and less logistically challenging versions of these vaccines. Look, I think politicians are basically and policymakers are trying to give people hope. They say this will be over in a few months and so on. But I think that they're all just too afraid to say the truth, is that we're going to be living with this crisis for the next few years, 2 or 3 years.
All right. Iris Makler, do you agree with that? And I wonder if in Israel, preparations are already underway to roll out these vaccines that apparently are making pretty good progress.
Yes, preparations here are, and sadly I do agree with Bozu actually. Certainly for the hot countries around here that don't have great infrastructure, yes. In Israel, I can say that they're already discussing all the possibilities. They have a deal. They had originally a deal with Moderna, then Pfizer's was the first one. They've now got some coming from there. They've got a third lot coming in from Russia. I can actually see people saying, I don't want the Russian vaccine. I do want Moderna, or the Dolly Parton vaccine, as I've seen it called on Twitter, because she did some funding towards it, gave some money. So yes, there are preparations underway. And, all of these logistical questions are being dealt with, not quickly enough. Lots of criticism of the government here for how it's handled the logistics at every step of the way. Also questions about whether certain communities, such as parts of the ultra-Orthodox community who don't like to be vaccinated, whether they will accept the vaccines. I think, there's all these questions of whether you can enforce a vaccine in these circumstances. So all of that being discussed right now here. Yeah.
Bozu, is that a similar concern from the people that you speak to, that there is concern perhaps about the safety of some of these vaccines? I know there is a lot of misinformation out there, people in a number of places saying they're unwilling to take a vaccine.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's going to be a problem. And you've got all this fake news out there and all these videos by these anti-vaxxers and so on, disinformation via Facebook and YouTube, that's causing people to be prejudiced against vaccines in general, thinking there's some kind of, deep state conspiracy. So I think that will be a factor as well. You've got the people out there who are just anti-vaxxers and they're not going to take this. And then you have more reasonable people who are just like, I don't want to be the first to take this.
Yeah, and I wonder, Iris, is the anti-vaxxer movement something that we've seen grow in Israel in the past couple of months?
Funnily enough, no, I haven't seen it grow particularly. I mean, there are the same anti-vaxxers that there are everywhere. I'm Australian. I know there's a sizable anti-vaxxer community there. There's a very large anti-vaxxer community in the United States. So I haven't seen anything grow in the past 2 months particularly. But I did think it was interesting, that study the poll I just saw, that only a third of women were prepared to be amongst the first to take the new vaccine. And, there is something to that. We may see in the future that there's actually a competition or a difference in the success rates of these vaccines as the trials go ahead and as people start taking them. So I can imagine that people are going to be a little bit hesitant at the beginning, even if they are prepared to take them, and may wait to be in the second tranche of people.
Bozu Daragaye, I hope you don't think this is too personal a question. We've got a minute or so left. I just want to ask you, are you concerned about any of these vaccines? If you were offered one, might you take it?
Yeah, I wouldn't want to be the first person, but if they said that it was safe and you should take it, I would try. I come from medical family. My parents are doctors or nurses. My relatives are in the medical field, so maybe more trust than usual in medicine and science.
All right, Iris, same question to you. And I ask you, if I may, specifically about this Russian vaccine that you've mentioned a few times that you've said is being focused on in Israel.
I don't know. I don't know if I would take the Russian vaccine. I might hang out for the Dolly Parton vaccine.
All right, well noted. Iris, thank you very much indeed. Iris Makler for us there in Jerusalem. Bozu Daragai there, the international correspondent for The Independent. Thank you both very much indeed for joining The World This Week, this Friday. Thanks to you for watching the programme. Do stay with us. Much more world news coming up. For me, though, good night.